can assure you that what you will observe is a vast wasteland.
It is to try and channel it
You
to
will see a procession of peace and
deny what I think is false argument. Free and uncorrupted communication.
Okay, our objective is to finish by 12:30, and I will leave the introductions to your reading. They are in the program that was prepared by the Coalition, and invite as our first speaker to the forum, Carol Bogert, Associate Director of Human Rights Watch.
Thank you. You know, we who live in New York suspect, uh-oh, there goes the bell. We suspect that you who live in Southern California live in sunny weather and beautiful temperatures all year long, and then we come to Southern California and we see that you actually do live that way. It's very impressive, and it's very impressive that all of you have come into this dark theater to talk about some dark subjects, but that's the price of democracy. If we lived in a totalitarian country, we wouldn't have to care about the details. But we live in a democracy, and it's incumbent upon us to inform ourselves, to know what's going on, and to shape an opinion. The question, has the war on terror made us safer, is a hard one to answer. Difficult calculation, I think. Certainly a lot of bad people who have it out for us have been captured and prevented from committing heinous acts. I think that's true. And I want to say at the outset that the Human Rights Watch and the Human Rights Movement is entirely supportive of efforts to apprehend and punish the perpetrators of September 11th, the perpetrators of what happened in Amman, in Jordan, just this week. But when we talk about the war on terror, I think we have to start with some of the words. We just had a discussion of what "we" means. The word terrorism is not universally understood. There is no international accepted definition of what terrorism is. And there are efforts at the United Nations to hammer out a definition of that word, and they haven't succeeded. Part of the problem is the question of whether or not states can be responsible for terrorism, or whether only armed groups and individuals can commit terrorist acts. But when a government or government forces kill a huge number of civilians, is that terrorism or not? It's a difficult question that the international community hasn't managed to answer. The other word in the war on terrorism is the word war. And again, I think that is that's a problematic term, perhaps, to use in this effort to make Americans safer. There is no defined battlefield for this war. There is not even a defined enemy. And war, of course, in international legal terms, enables governments to suspend certain human rights protections and to take certain extraordinary measures. And we've seen this, for example, when the U.S. government has simply effectively kidnapped people from Bosnia, let's say, several people who were simply disappeared from the face of the earth. And because every part of this globe is considered part of the battlefield in the war on terror. So enemies who are sighted anywhere are theoretically fair game. And even in our own country, you remember the case of Jose Padilla, who was arrested in O'Hare Airport. He's an American citizen. And theoretically, under the laws of war, if we're in a war, they could have shot Jose Padilla in the airport right there and shot him dead. He's an enemy combatant. And that's the kind of legally complicated situation we find ourselves in when we use the term war in this effort to combat terrorism. And it has resulted in some interesting legal and even constitutional complexities that our courts are still dealing with today, and I want to get to that a little later. I think the real question, though, is how this war is being conducted, and is the way in which this war being conducted, making us safer. And I really want to start with the issue where I think it kind of all went wrong. And that was the decision to deny the protections of the Geneva Conventions to detainees who were held at Guantanamo Bay. So in January of 2002, when those detention facilities were set up and the Bush administration announced that the detainees held there were not prisoners of war, but they were unlawful combatants. This was, I think, a very fateful decision, and one that has had extremely negative consequences in a number of ways that I want to talk about. Senator Patrick Leahy has called Guantanamo Bay the primary recruiting tool for our enemies. And I think he's right. It's not just that Guantanamo Bay is a kind of legal black hole where standards of treatment for the people held there are unclear, but that it was intended, it was chosen because it would be a legal black hole, because it was extraterritorial, not part of the continental United States, not part of U.S. territory. And it was clear that it was chosen in part because the U.S. government felt that that meant the rules would be a little slipperier, a little easier to bend in Guantanamo Bay than they would be here inside the United States. I think we're really talking about three issues that have arisen from this fateful decision. And I want to address them in the time I have left. The first is a real besmirching of U.S. leadership around the world. The second is the problem of torture. And the third is damage done to legal and constitutional protections that Americans, I think, have always taken for granted. So let's start by talking about what's happened to the U.S. reputation around the world as a result of Guantanamo. Human Rights Watch is an organization that conducts research in 70 countries around the world into what's happening in human rights in those countries. And one of our researchers was in Malaysia last year. And he was doing research into the Internal Security Act and how people are being detained in greater numbers now in Malaysia using this longstanding law since the War on Terror. And one of the things that he heard from detainees in Malaysia who'd been arrested by their own government under this law was that in interrogation, when the interrogator really wanted to start putting the screws on you and scare you, what he would say was, if you don't tell me, we're going to send you to Guantanamo. This has become a kind of international shorthand for a lawless place where the most terrifying things can be done to you, regardless of what's actually happening in Guantanamo. And we know that prisoners have been abused there. In the minds of people around the world, it is an absolutely terrifying hell. And it is being held out in that way by repressive governments around the world. The war on terror is becoming associated with repression in other countries. It is cited as an excuse for some of the worst things that governments are doing. The government of Zimbabwe, for example, when Mugabe arrested journalists a couple of years ago, he said, well, they're terrorists. Every critic of a repressive government is labeled a terrorist. In Uzbekistan, where Human Rights Watch has been doing quite a lot of research recently, you may know the government slaughtered hundreds of people in the eastern part of the country, a town called Andijan. And it's a complicated story which I won't tell you all of, but it was essentially a peaceful uprising of people on the main square of this town that was simply shot upon by government forces in broad daylight. It's the Tiananmen Square of our times, but we don't know it because there were no international television cameras there. Extremely brutal massacre. And right now in Tashkent, the capital of Uzbekistan, the Uzbek government is conducting show trials. trying to purvey the government line that international terrorists sparked this event, that they are responsible for all of the deaths. And they're trotting a series of witnesses to this kangaroo court who probably have been tortured or certainly have been threatened with torture to parrot the government line that international terrorism is responsible for everything that happened in Andijan. When of course we know that government forces killed hundreds of civilians there. So in Uzbekistan, in Egypt and Jordan, countries where the United States has very strong influence and where the United States and European countries have been rendering suspects, sending suspected terrorists so that they can be effectively tortured there. Increasingly, the war on terror is being associated with human rights abuse. Whether the United States intends it or not, this language has been appropriated by repressive governments who are seeking to preserve their own power by calling all of their enemies terrorists. Of course, U.S. leadership globally has been affected by this, and our ability to stand up and say we are leaders in the war on terror is compromised by the fact that the war on terror is associated with some of these dark deeds. It's also, of course, caused a rift. The way the war on terror is being conducted, and in particular I think Guantanamo Bay is the signal event in the beginning of this war, caused a real rift between the United States and its closest allies in Western Europe. Some of the disagreement between the U.S. and its European allies has been over the Iraq war, whether or not to go to war in Iraq. But I think more fundamentally the disagreement is about international law. European countries believe in it and think that it should be followed. And they fear that the U.S. government, in the way it conducts the war on terror, has been willing to disregard, ignore, and even willfully defy international legal precepts that have been long accepted. The Geneva Conventions, of course, being one of the most widely accepted pieces of international law in human history. Now, just recently we've seen this rift between the U.S. and its closest allies exacerbated by the revelation of secret detention facilities of the CIA in European countries. And Human Rights Watch has presented some evidence that those countries are Poland and Romania. Poland, of course, is a member of the European Union. And this has caused extraordinary outrage in Europe. You may have read a little bit about it in the U.S. press, but believe me, as an organization that was taking a lot of press calls, we were inundated with interest in this problem in Europe. Now, the issue of torture is obviously also one that has besmirched U.S. leadership and America's name in the world. And I think that the problem of torture and the way this has arisen in our society, and I think it's shocking to many of us that in this new millennium we're even talking about torture, that this is a public conversation in this country about the possibility of using torture. It's a taboo that has been established over hundreds of years in human history. It took a long time to build it up, and we're doing it great damage in a very short amount of time. I think that this also in some ways had its origins in the decision not to accord the protection of the Geneva Conventions to detainees in the war on terror. And I would cite to you a quote from a member of the 377th Military Police Company who told the New York Times in May 2004, "We were pretty much told they were nobodies," they meaning the detainees, "that they were just enemy combatants, not prisoners of war. I think that giving them the distinction of soldier would have changed our attitude toward them." If any of you have had a chance to see the book by Captain Yi, the Muslim chaplain at Guantanamo Bay, who was ultimately arrested by his own government under suspicion of nefarious acts, who was in fact only trying to provide religious advice and comfort to men at Guantanamo Bay who were under extreme duress and certainly cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment at times. the way he describes how that camp has been run, the disregard and the willful desecration of the Quran, for example, something that is held sacred by Muslims everywhere, and the atmosphere of anti-Islam feeling, and that the people who are being detained there are lower than human. And as this military police officer said, that they were nobodies. They were just enemy combatants. They weren't prisoners of war. They were somehow less than people. And it is this kind of attitude that gave rise to the ability of our own fellow citizens, young service members in Abu Ghraib, and not only in Abu Ghraib, in many other places as well, that I think provided the justification in some thought process that you could treat another human being in that way, because they're less than human. They're not POWs, and we don't respect them. And that was clear from this decision on the Geneva Conventions, and it filtered through, I think, the way, unfortunately, we saw too many people, too many Americans treating detainees, as I say, not only in Abu Ghraib, but certainly in other detention facilities around the world. We are having an annual dinner supporting Human Rights Watch in Santa Barbara on Tuesday, and one of the people we're honoring at that dinner is a human rights activist from Iran. We brought him to Washington recently, and he was really taken aback when a congressperson, surely not Lois Capps, asked him, "So, I hear President Bush is really popular in Iran." And I think the questioner was not wrong in that there is a lot of anti-Iranian government feeling inside Iran. It's not a popular government. And there is a lot of interest in America and American movies and American culture in Iran. But what our Iranian human rights friend replied was, "You have no idea how the images of Abu Ghraib are played over and over and over again on Iranian TV. And nobody in Iran thinks that President Bush is a good guy." So the way that the United States has been linked with some of the worst deeds of our times and the most publicized deeds of our times, I think has not made us safer. It has the practical effect of increasing the number of our enemies in the world. It also has it may have another practical effect, and I'm not an expert in this, but I've heard a man called Darius Rajali, who teaches up at Reed College in Oregon, make a very interesting analysis of how abusive detention practices in Vietnam, it's documentable that they migrated back into the United States after the war, and that some of the people who were prison guards in Abu Ghraib come home to the United States where they are prison guards or policemen, and that there is a documentable increase in abuse against people in detention inside the United States as a result of the kinds of training and the kinds of things that people have seen in wars that are being conducted abroad. But certainly it's the effect on service members is very powerful. The demoralizing effect that this torture scandal has had on the U.S. Army and U.S. Armed Forces, all the services, I think is really demonstrable. We recently published a report based on testimony of a very brave guy called Captain Ian Fishback, 27-year-old West Point graduate, 26-year-old West Point graduate, who served at Forward Operating Base Mercury, that's outside of Fallujah in Iraq, and saw incredible things, incredible things. He saw military intelligence officers continually asking guards to soften up detainees for interrogation. He saw detainees with extremes of heat and cold, sleep deprivation, various kinds of so-called stress techniques, which sound like a kind of torture light. You may remember Donald Rumsfeld saying, "What's so bad about making a detainee stand for a long time? I stand at my desk." It's not a joke. It's not torture light. It's something that can drive a person insane. with discomfort and pain. He saw he described how military guards were taking out their stress on the detainees. When they'd had a hard day, they would come back and just beat people up for fun. He saw one guard break a detainee's leg with a Louisville Slugger baseball bat for fun. The demoralizing effect on Captain Fishback, who went to his superiors and tried to report this abuse and was told, be quiet, don't ruin your career, this is not good, stop. He, over a period of months, tried to report this, and he finally came to Human Rights Watch because he'd heard about our work and the torture issue in Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib and Afghanistan. And after we published our report, he also introduced us to other officers, a couple of sergeants who had witnessed similar things. And since we published that report, we've been deluged by young men and women from the armed forces who want to tell about what they've seen. And they can't live with what they've seen. And they're not proud of what they've seen. And I think the demoralizing effect on service members who see that a few lower level baddies from Abu Ghraib are being prosecuted, but the people who made the decisions to introduce those kinds of stress techniques, the higher-ups in the military and in civilian leadership, are going scot-free. They're not being investigated for what they're doing. At the beginning of the Abu Ghraib scandal, Colin Powell said, watch America now. Watch what we do to uncover where this scandal leads. Well, we're Human Rights Watch. We're watching. And the U.S. government is doing what every government does that's caught in a scandal like this. They're pushing responsibility down to lower-level individuals and trying to get past it. And part of the job of Human Rights Watch is to continue bringing these issues to the public domain. I want to speak just briefly. Am I allowed to have a couple more seconds? Seconds. Well, at some point I wanted to address the ticking time bomb question, because this is the justification for torture that is raised again and again. And it was raised in the LA Times op-ed that Peter mentioned a minute ago. And it is such a canard. It is such a red herring. It is such a lousy argument. And if there are people in this audience who are concerned about torture and who want to know how to combat that ticking time bomb argument, I want you to walk out of the room armed with the arguments that I think you'll find squash it pretty flat. But maybe we'll have time to get to that later, because I don't want to go through that now. But I do want to draw your attention to the Israeli example, because the United States government is currently the only government in the world that is claiming for itself the right to use cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment on detainees in its under its control. And you're asking who makes the argument for torture? Well, Vice President Dick Cheney and CIA Director Porter Goss have been on Capitol Hill to argue that non-Americans held outside the United States should be, under certain circumstances, subjected to such treatment, and that should be legal. The McCain legislation is trying to make that illegal, and Cheney and Goss are lobbying against it. We are currently the only government. Many governments torture clandestinely, but we're currently the only government in the world that's making that argument publicly, that we have the right to do that. Once upon a time, the Israeli government was the only government in the world that made that argument. And if you're familiar with the Landau Commission in 1987, it was formed to examine the practices of Shin Bet and how they were treating Palestinian detainees. And what they found was, and what ensued for 12 years after the Landau Commission in 87, was that agents of Shin Bet were allowed to use psychological pressure and quote-unquote moderate physical pressure that was never supposed to reach the level of physical torture, that was the goal, against Palestinian detainees who had information of an emergency nature that could save Israeli lives if only it could be extracted from the detainee. So it was an attempt to regulate it. It should only be moderate pressure, and it should only be in these certain extraordinary circumstances. So what happened? Thousands and maybe tens of thousands of Palestinian detainees were severely abused as a result. It proved impossible to limit the cases to actual ticking time bomb scenarios. It very naturally slid down a slippery slope so that it was routinely used by Shin Bet interrogators against detainees. Moreover, it was not just moderate pressure. What exactly is moderate pressure? The techniques that were used, which sounded, as Secretary Rumsfeld said, what's so bad about standing up for a little while? Well, if you're forced to stand up for long enough and to hold heavy objects while you're standing, if you're forced to sit on a chair that's tilted forward a little bit with a hood over your head, it doesn't sound so bad, but if you're doing it hour after hour after hour, it has an extremely deleterious effect on the human body. Moderate physical pressure was not the result. The result was something much more serious. And the regulatory mechanisms that the Landau Commission envisaged, that there would be ways to gain approval for this, that there would be oversight of this process, totally failed. And routinely, approval was given to use these kinds of techniques against a huge number of people. And the court system did not intervene to stop it. So it was not until 1999 that the Israeli Supreme Court put an end to that practice. And thank goodness that they did. And I think there's a lesson in there that if the United States thinks that it can use torture selectively and intelligently, it's not possible. That's not the way it works. It's not going to work for us, just as it didn't work for the Israelis. It's a real mistake. I hear my bell being dinged. I hope that we can talk about some of the other issues a little later in the presentation. Thank you for listening.
I'll ask John Aguila if he has any response, and the counter can come from Carol after his response.
Okay, I believe I have 3 minutes, so I'm just going to talk real fast. Thank you all for being here. It's my second year coming. Last year I was asked to defend the Bush Doctrine of preemptive war. This year, American policy towards these many violations of human rights. What are you going to do to me next year, Peter? Defend bunker-busting nuclear weapons. I'll come back just to find out what new challenge you have. He was right earlier when he said there won't be a lot of debate here, because my own belief is that most of us feel very similarly about issues of right and wrong. I don't speak to you from a red or blue perspective, or right or left. I'm interested in right or wrong, and most of us have a reasonable sense of this, and I think Carol and I, and probably everyone here, agrees that torture is something that simply shouldn't be going on. And there's little more to say than that. In my 3 minutes, though, I do want to address a couple of the issues on the table. Terror, what is that war? What is it now? And how to fight in a just way. I know we have some people interested in theology and philosophy here, and I think we should address that issue as well. In a nutshell, we've taken the position that terror is whatever they do, and a war on terror is whatever we do. And I think that's terribly wrong-headed. Through most of history, terror, the deliberate targeting of non-combatants, has been the province of great states and empires. The Romans had a term for it. They called it destructive war. The Mongols, if a city somewhere decided to stand a siege against them, would kill everyone in the city except for 1 or 2 people and spread the word that that's what they'd do if you resisted. They used terror as a tactic. Why is terror now in the hands of non-state actors? Because we live in a time when small groups are tremendously empowered. That began with explosives a century ago, and now in an interconnected world, it allows small groups to ride the rails of our technology to strike at us. That's the nature of warfare. It's no longer the province of the nation or the empire. I hear a cell phone going off. I teach at a military school. I say to my students, cell phones are fine. Every ring costs you half a grade. So if it's one of your students, half a grade comes off. The bigger question here about war is, so we have these small groups who can do these things, so war is now something that doesn't require another nation, just a small group. And we are embroiled. We're in the 5th year of the first great war between nations and networks. It's odd on the battlefield, it's odd off the battlefield, and it's especially difficult to grapple with in the area of detainees and captives. So we have something complex, new, unusual, and we've gone astray here and there. And I think it's something that, while we can recognize that it is just to fight this war, it began with an attack that killed thousands of Americans and did hundreds of billions of dollars of damage. It is incumbent upon us to wage this war in a just fashion. And in my longer remarks, I'm going to suggest that we have tended to break those laws of war in a number of ways, and not only with detainees, but on the battlefield as well. Someone tell me, what does shock and awe bombing have to do with liberating people? Bombing designed to awe people into submission, which in fact kills tens of thousands of innocent non-combatants. If I want to talk about the besmirching of the American reputation, I think it lies directly at the doorstep of this notion of winning by dropping 2,000-pound bombs on people. I'm guessing that my 3 minutes are close to up, and when I come back to you, I'm going to talk a lot more about this problem of fighting a war justly and trying to see that that's done on both sides. And I begin to see a little bit of light on each side. We're not doing so much of that bombing anymore, thanks to the work of Carol and some brave soldiers standing up, and all of you who are concerned about this. We are going to treat detainees in a much better fashion in the days and years ahead. And even on the other side, we have Dr. Zawahiri sending a letter off to Zarqawi in Iraq saying, stop beheading people and stop attacking innocent civilians, fight the Americans. So for me, even in such a terrible thing as war, there is an essential humanity that cannot be denied and which will, in the end, reassert itself. Thank you.
Happy to see that an acknowledgement of expired time is a reason to take another deep breath and continue. Carol?
Well, I just wanted to address this one? Yeah. I wanted to address the question that you raised there at the end, John, about the atmosphere in the Middle East, mostly, towards the targeting of civilians. Human Rights Watch has recently published a report about the Iraqi insurgents who are killing civilians intentionally. Now, we don't use the term terrorism because it's not a legally clear term, but we do use the term crimes against humanity. We do use the term war crimes. And I think in some ways the human rights lexicon, which includes those terms, is a more solid one for describing what is going on in that region. Because these are internationally accepted terms. And our goal is to try to enhance the acceptance of the idea that targeting civilians is never okay, no matter what the cause, in the Middle East. It's not easy, but I can tell you that one of the things we found, we're on a sort of 2-year project around the Middle East to promote this idea, to meet with civil society groups in countries around the region, and to talk with them about being more vocal for their support, in their support for not killing civilians intentionally. We found something interesting. There is very little support for the Iraqi insurgents. We've been so far, we're just beginning this project, we've been so far in Egypt, Jordan, and Ramallah on the West Bank. Very little support. And I think that may be because the victims are Muslims. There is more support for the suicide bombings of Palestinian extremists, particularly when it's outside the Green Line. There's no feeling that Israeli settlers deserve the protections of the Geneva Conventions as civilians. But this is, I think, a real challenge for the human rights movement today, and it's one that we're taking very seriously, which is how to spread this culture of human rights, the respect for the individual, and the idea that civilians in wartime can never be intentionally targeted. How do we spread that idea throughout the region and increase its acceptance? Because I think it is achieving that consensus among all people in the world that is what's really going to make us safer.
We turn tables and invite Associate Professor John Arguella from the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey to give us his longer view of this question. John?
Turn me on. There we are. Yeah, I don't like to be behind one of those, although there's the risk here that those of you who were here last year and those who will see the video of this will realize that I only own one blazer. That's okay. That's all right. And I've been a full professor for a couple years, so update for the next time. When you have me come next year to defend some other odd topic, make me a full professor on your list. I've got 20 minutes. Forcing me to answer in 3 minutes really focused my mind. I said everything I need to say, I believe. Let me comment on something Douglas said earlier. He feels safer. And he feels safer because this war, in a funny way, is encouraging the rise of civil society. People like yourselves. We didn't stop President Bush from going into Iraq, but we made him wait. For about 6 months, he had to deal with a great deal of opposition in this country and around the world. And that's a good thing. Because what would happen if the president said, well, we know those WMD are really, they made it in trucks over the Syrian border. Now we have to go invade Syria. Do you think that the president would get a vote in the Senate this time? Not a chance in the world. So maybe you didn't work the first time, but it will work again. For those of you who were here last year, you know that I was a vocal opponent of going into Iraq because I saw it as an unnecessary war. I still feel that way. I wrote about that in the New York Times beforehand, before that war, and in my regular columns in the San Francisco Chronicle, the Sunday Insight. I'm probably going to alienate a few of you by saying I don't think we can just leave Iraq now. And since we have a wonderful congressional representative here, let me suggest where I think the debate needs to go. In Iraq, the story is not stay and fight or cut and run. It's got to be a third way between the two. There has to be a way to reach across red and blue. That's why this Coalition for Global Dialogue is so important. There is a way for us to cut the number of troops we have there today very sharply, and to keep a residual force there for a more indefinite period. If you give a fixed date, the enemy will simply lie low until you leave and then declare victory. But we could get rid of 2/3 of the troops we have there today, because 90% of them are there protecting each other. Even when they go to a brothel, there are 10 Humvees, and 9 of them remain fully armed and on alert while the guys from the 10th go in, and then they back and forth. That's how they operate. Force protection. So, you talk about protection when you're engaging in such things. Well, protection means 9 more Humvees. Don't need all of that over there. We need what our commandos are doing, which is very effective. We need what the Marines are doing in small squads. They're working with Iraqis like they did at the beginning of Vietnam before they went astray with big units. Marines will often go into a small village and just live there, and they get a great deal of intelligence. And not only do Muslims in general oppose the bombing campaign of Zarqawi, but most Iraqis, including in the Sunni community, don't like that kind of warfare. And I think my hat's off to Carol and all of those who suggest that we need to take warfare in the 21st century to a form in which, when it is fought, is a terrible tragedy when war breaks out. But if it does, we must not lose our essential humanity. We must protect the immunity of the non-combatant. And that's something that both sides have to adhere to. And our enemies are violators of human rights far, far worse than we. That doesn't excuse our own actions by any means. And in my view, this is a war that's largely going to be won or lost in the court of world opinion. The besmirching of the U.S. reputation is largely a function of our own actions. Think of the gains in the world if we simply came out and said we will never torture. There is simply no need to do so, and it's wrong. So we're not going to do that. We're not going to use shock and awe bombing, which kills thousands of civilians. That also is a human rights violation, in my view. We're not going to do that either. If we're going to fight face to face. In Afghanistan, I'm very proud of a lot of our troops. I teach at a military school in Monterey. It's called a Navy school, but my program is for special operations soldiers, and mostly spending their time in Afghanistan and Kurdistan and other places around the world. And they fight in small teams, and they fight with allies. In the Sahara, they destroyed 2 terror affiliates of Al-Qaeda this past year, working with Algerian and Chadian and some paramilitary forces from the area, just a thimbleful of our force. And in Afghanistan, They don't go out dropping 2,000-pound bombs on anybody. They go out in squads of 6 and 8 soldiers. Why do they do this? To try to induce the Taliban to come out and fight. And they have had engagements all through this year, killing over 1,200 Taliban in pitched battles, not aerial bombing. Often our forces are outnumbered 5, 6, and 7 to 1. They do this so as to draw them out, to fight, if you will, in a just fashion. That's the kind of way that this war should be fought. Not with bombs coming down from 20,000 feet, not with people being forced to wear hoods in detention centers. Fighting a stand-up fight is not only good in military sense, it's good public relations for us as well. People see, okay, you have dignified what's happened by calling it a war on terror. Then by George, make it look like a war. Fight it like a war. Treat those you detain as prisoners of war. And I would add one other point. That also means, if it's a war, be willing to negotiate. Very few wars end in unconditional surrender, and I assure you this one will not. But this is a war where negotiation can happen. And that, I think, is also an essential form of respecting human rights. Even these adversaries are those with whom we have to think about diplomatic solutions. And I think it's, in a case of al-Qaeda being a network of networks, there's an easy way for us to take slices of this. Quietly in Iraq over the past year, we have made overtures to various insurgent groups among the indigenous Iraqis, saying, please just lay down your arms and we will withdraw from this place. And so in most of the Shiite part of the country, American forces have withdrawn. Remember the fighting in Najaf, Muqtada al-Sadr? Well, that's a negotiation. And basically his brigades maintain order in a part of the country, and our forces are in very, very diminished numbers in that area. In all of the Kurdish part of the country, there are fewer than 300 American troops right now. So there's negotiation possible there. There's negotiation. Amnesties have been offered by the Saudi government to the al-Qaeda fighters who were trying to overthrow them. We went into Iraq in March of 2003. Al-Qaeda went into Saudi Arabia in April 2003, and the Saudis had to fight very, very hard to keep from being toppled over. And what they did is they fought hard, but they also negotiated, and they offered amnesties, and hundreds of al-Qaeda turned themselves in. And when people saw that those who were amnestied were treated well, al-Qaeda members from out of the country came in to surrender. How about that one? All right, so, yeah, I have to tell you, for the life of me, I'm not red or blue. So I don't understand this, but I don't understand why both ends of the political spectrum in the United States, whether you're Michael Moore or, Dinty Moore off on the right, you don't like the Saudis. And I don't understand that. They've been a long-time ally. They are an authoritarian country, but there are many of those in the world. And if they go down, the terrorists have their finger on the pulse of the global economy. So we have to think very, very hard before trying to export our ways of government. For me, this is a problem also with the idea of democratization in Iraq itself. Do you really want democracy there? What's going to happen if we have an American-style democracy as we're fighting to achieve in Iraq? The Shia will basically control the country's policies. And who are the Shia closely aligned with? Iran. Now, Iran, wait a minute, aren't they part of the axis of evil? Or are they just an honorary member? Come on. So we've spent 2,000 lives killed, 15,000 wounded, and upward of $300 billion so as to create a new country that will be aligned with one of our most serious enemies. You follow the logic? It goes to this question of the complexity of this war. And part of it is the problem of it being the first great war of nation and network. We're focusing on nations when we shouldn't be. We should be ripping apart cells and nodes of al-Qaeda all over the world. Every day we should be hitting a cell somewhere instead of spending all of our efforts and putting all of our forces into countries, trying to remake countries. That's a very fraught business. It's one that divides us at home, it divides us in the world, and will continue to do so. But what everyone will stand with us to do is to take down the various cells of al-Qaeda. Who has helped us, by the way, to preempt two major planned attacks on American forces, one on naval headquarters in Bahrain, and one at a place I'm not allowed to say where that attack is, otherwise you'd all have to be detained. So I won't name the other one. But who helped us with that? Would you believe me if I told you Syria? Yes, Syria. Syria handed back Saddam's brother-in-law to us and a bunch of other high-ranking insurgent leaders who were fomenting the insurgency from out of the country, but also gave us what's called actionable intelligence on at least 2 occasions. Now, what's the problem? When you pillory the Syrians publicly, after a while, they get tired of that. So now they've stopped their intelligence cooperation with us. It's a funny war. Even those you consider your adversaries can sometimes be great use to you. And even Iran, for example, remember, they're in that axis of evil, plays a huge role in maintaining the stability of the Shiite community in Iraq. They have encouraged al-Sistani to say to his people, be patient, democracy is coming, your time is coming. And the Iranians have played an important role in maintaining stability in a very large portion of Iraq and should be encouraged to continue doing that. So we have this very, very complex business. And my basic message to you is that you won't win this war by occupying other countries. Look what happened to Iraq. There was no terrorism there before we went in. Now the very fact that we are there has created a hothouse environment for terror. That's not how this war is fought. It's not World War II. It's not. I see a lot of members of the greatest generation in the room. Thank you this day after Veterans Day for World War II. I see some Vietnam veterans here. Thank you, under difficult circumstances, carrying out the policies of our country. I'm from sort of the pretty good generation. You know, we're trying. We're doing our best. But we're on the cusp of this different sort of age where it doesn't look like World War II or Korea or even Vietnam, which had huge periods of conventional warfare, the Tet Offensive, the Easter Offensive, and then, of course, the final 1975 offensive against Saigon. It's a very different war where it's handfuls of troops. Who's the Patton of this war? You're not going to have one. The Pattons are captains and majors leading small teams in dark, drafty, dusty places around the world, disrupting enemy cells and nodes. That's the war that needs to be fought. It doesn't require mass detentions. You know how many we've detained? I'm sure Carol knows this. Over 80,000 people in Iraq have been detained. Now that's odd because we've said there were only 5,000 insurgents. You know, is that what the president would call fuzzy math? I think so. 80% of them are released after a short period of varying kinds of treatment. It's not that kind of war. That's not how you find out about where the enemy is. It's a game of hiders and finders waged on a global basis. And so to the extent to which people can no longer trust you, the besmirching of our reputation that Carol speaks to, that's the central problem. If people don't like you, don't trust you, don't want to work with you, you will know less and you will be able to do less. I want to say 2 other things before my time expires. The damn bell, where the hell is it? There it is. Okay. Two other things. There's a human rights issue that doesn't have to do with detention or the killing of non-combatants. It's the question of civil liberties. And I am particularly, as a professor, troubled by the notion, and I was troubled when I heard it in the President's remarks yesterday, that somehow it is unpatriotic to question the war in Iraq or policy or the rationale for why policies were undertaken. And I think that, to my mind, is one of the more troubling things that has gone on in this war. As an American, I feel safer. We've learned a little bit about Homeland Security. We have struck the enemy hard in other places. It's very difficult for them to come here. That's why I feel safer here. I also, thanks to Douglas, feel safer because I know that a civil society is on the rise that's going to help eradicate terror, which is a problem beyond our own ability to grapple. And we will create a world governed by this civil society that constrains even American power. And I like that. I like that idea a lot. But what I am troubled by is the notion that if you say something of a critical nature, you're somehow less American. And so there is this chilling effect that's emerged. And I think that too is a part of human rights that we need to be concerned about. very much. And so I would urge all of you, you all came here on a lovely Saturday morning. I would urge all of you, just as you've expended some effort to be here, expend some effort to keep speaking your mind. Let your congressperson know. I talk with mine, Sam Farr, a lot, who's a wonderful representative. And they listen. That's what I've learned. They listen. They take ideas back. We have to keep speaking no matter what. And I think at the end of the day, this example of Americans being willing to look at themselves in the mirror, being willing to criticize, that's the beginning. It's not shutting down Guantanamo, but that first act as if you are completely free to speak, and you will be. I say this as somebody who works for the military. I've got scar tissue from saying a lot of things. A year ago, I said we should start negotiating with different aspects of the terrorist organization, so I got scar tissue on that side. And then I said we need to, in an article 3 months ago, that we needed to pull out 2/3 of our troops immediately. I got scar tissue, not yet healed from that. I'm not here to tell you how wonderful I am. I'm here to tell you that it is possible, and I'm here to tell you that in our system, we cannot quietly allow this erosion of our rights to occur. Whether you're, thank you. Well, you know what they say, when they clap, you just leave after that. Those are my basic thoughts. I think I'm close to out of time. Yes, I do think we're safer in a small sense, that is our own territorial limits. But let's go back to Doug's point. Who's the we here? The we is the world. And how is the world? If you look at State Department official statistics, what you see is in 2001, there were 45 significant terrorist attacks. What do you suppose that number was in the year 2004? Anybody? 651. Are we, the world, safer? Not at all. The war on terror has spawned more terror. All right? And it bedevils countries around the world. At least 16, 17 different countries have had these significant terrorist attacks in these past few years. Now, part of the way we bring that number down is by striking at these groups in many parts of the world. The other part of it is by restoring our reputation for good in the world. Sometimes we think that America makes morals. It's the other way around. Morals made America. And to the extent to which we rediscover that and comport ourselves more appropriately, even in this odd new kind of war, then we'll find that everything will come aright in the end, because we will have allies, we'll have information, and we'll have the safer world that we're all looking for. Thank you very much.
Carol, quick response.
Could it be made to work? Perfect. Okay, I'm so relieved to have found something that I can disagree with John about. Because I wouldn't want you to come this morning to a putative debate in which the two main speakers basically said the same stuff. I have to take issue with, unfortunately I only found one thing to disagree with you about, but I do want to raise it because I think it's important. And that is the idea that we have authoritarian allies, and to make you a bit of a straw man, you didn't say it quite this baldly, but they deserve our unquestioning support because they're our friends. And, you know, après eux, le déluge, you know, it'll be a disaster once they're off the stage. I think that's a mistake. And I think that's not enhancing America's national interest, our own security, or human rights. This has to be a war for something. And I think, John, you said that very well. It's really a war about an idea. And it's the idea of respect for life. The terrorists don't respect life. They kill civilians on purpose. And our values say that we don't do that. It has to be about these values of human rights that are universally declared and universally accepted throughout the United Nations and are signed onto by many countries who are not practicing what the treaties they've signed obligate them to do. I don't think that unquestioning support for Saudi Arabia over now many decades has earned us any friends in that country. And I think the instability that we face and the fact that very dangerous people could come to power after the current regime, should it fall, is partly the result of the repressive nature of that government over many decades. As you all know, at least half of the population, that is, all the women in that country, do not have rights. There is no fair court system. There is no freedom of expression. There is no freedom of association. It is an extremely repressive country, not a little bit authoritarian. And people in Saudi Arabia, to the extent that one can, of course, assess public opinion, but I think it's fair to say that people who live under highly authoritarian governments generally don't like it. That's certainly the experience of Human Rights Watch. We are not earning ourselves friends. We are creating future trouble by allying ourselves closely with regimes that seriously abuse human rights. Now, it is the case that we have multiple objectives sometimes with very difficult governments. But I think part of the art of diplomacy, and it's why it's described as an art, is that U.S. diplomats should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. And there has to be a way of conveying our profound criticism of repression and authoritarianism at the same time that we are pursuing other objectives with those governments. But it is not necessary simply to keep quiet about serious abuses of human rights because we have other fish to fry in the Middle East. And I think in so doing, and if we continue to do so, because that has been U.S. policy over many, many years, not to point to the problems of our friends in the region because they are our friends. If we continue to do that, we're creating bigger and bigger problems for ourselves down the road and certainly making everyone less secure, including the people who live in those countries. And let's start with them because they're suffering some very serious problems. And that's our issue too.
John, quick response.
It's almost a relief to know we disagree about something. I'm glad we didn't do completely false billing. Yeah, we're probably going to have to agree to disagree a little bit about this, but let me suggest a third way here is also possible. I think Carol puts her finger on it. We may not go to war for regime change to make these authoritarian countries democracies, but we certainly don't have to accept everything they're doing. And I think we're fully capable of having diplomats say, well, look, we simply don't agree with these practices. You know, for the life of me, I don't know why we still give over $2 billion a year to Israel, a place where, what are the human rights of people who are Arabs living in Israel? They don't have the same citizens' rights as others. So why continue to give economic support for those practices? I agree completely that there is a way to show our displeasure. I think also there are the larger questions of authoritarian countries that I think President Reagan called it constructive engagement, which resulted in authoritarians moving to democracy over a period of time from South Africa to Northeast Asia to the great blossoming of democracy in Latin America over the last 20 years. I think we have the same goal in mind. I would like to take a somewhat more measured pace simply because a change tomorrow in Saudi Arabia would bring rabid Islamists to power who would have their finger on the pulse of the global economy. In Pakistan, if the military dictator there were thrown out and elections were held, Islamists would be brought to power. Osama's popularity rating there is 67% in that country. George Bush's is 7%. And so we have to be, I think, in the name of strategic interest, I think we sometimes have to be measured, but we can always show our displeasure with any violations of human rights anywhere.
Thank you. We have two discussants who would like to respond to what they have heard this morning. I would encourage my friends and colleagues, Dr. Juan Campo from UC Santa Barbara in the field of religious studies, and Manu Eskandari from the political science department here at Santa Barbara City College, to have a conversation. What did you hear that was something that you could agree with? What did you hear that was something you'd like to disagree with? Dr. Campo, would you begin?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here on this very important day, celebrating, I think it's the 60th anniversary of the United Nations, at a time when we need to affirm more and more the themes and the values of international cooperation and dialogue. One of the areas that I think has been overlooked to some degree here in the discussions that we've already had is the voices of them. In other words, I'd like to include them as part of the we that we've been talking about. We haven't heard any voices about what do people living in the regions of the Middle East, particularly Iraq, what they have to say about what's going on in their homelands. And I'd like to start out with a quote. It may be familiar to you. It says, "Freedom's untidy, and free people are free to make mistakes and commit crimes and do bad things." Who was that? Yeah, Donald Rumsfeld, our Secretary of Defense. And he said that in March 2003, within a few weeks after we invaded and occupied Iraq. And he was saying that about the looting that was going on. But in a way, looking back over the last couple of years, that's kind of a mirror statement, right? It's almost as if he's talking about his own attitude and the attitude of the people that supported him and President Bush in going to war in Iraq. In other words, we're free to make mistakes and commit crimes and do bad things. Freedom's untidy. But how does it look from the other side? From the, with regard to the Iraqis themselves. In the lead up to the war, we were given a lot in our media about, and we had all these generals appearing on CNN, Fox, the major national broadcasting networks, talking about the technology of war and how effective our weapons are going to be and where we'd find what the troop strengths were of Saddam Hussein and his army and things like that, how many lives might be lost in terms of the combat. But a lot of technology was thrown into that with very little effort made to talk about, well, how are the Iraqis feeling about this at that time? And then also, very little has been said since we've invaded Iraq with respect to what are Iraqis thinking and feeling. We're only now just beginning to get these voices out. And I would highly recommend this particular book, Night Draws Near, by Anthony Shadid. Its subtitle is Iraq's People in the Shadow of America's War. And what he does in that book is give you conversations that he's had over the years in the months leading up to the most recent attack on Iraq, and in the months since that up until about the middle of 2004. And he gives you a vast variety of perspectives, indicating, to a great degree, it's not just Iraqis and us, or Sunni, Shiis, and Kurds. There's a really diverse and complex makeup of people over there, and they're not all Muslim in terms of their first identity. They might be secular, very secular individuals, and not following the line of a particular Ayatollah or Sunni imam. But let me give you one of these voices. This isn't from Anthony Shadid's book, but it is from a blog, which are popular these days. And this is from a woman who lives, an Iraqi woman in Baghdad. She's Sunni, and she calls herself Riverbend. Riverbend blog is the blog site. You can also, if you Google it, you can also look up Baghdad burning. And her entry for January 15th runs as follows in part. "I hope Americans feel good about taking their war on terror to foreign soil, for bringing the terrorists to Iraq. Chalabi, Alawi," who's now in Washington, D.C., I should say, Alawi, Zarqawi, and the Hakims, very prominent Shiite mullahs. "How is our current situation going to secure America? How is a complete generation that is growing up in fear and chaos going to view Americans 10 years from now? This is them, and are we safer as a result of all this?" Does anyone ask that? After September 11th, because of what a few fanatics did, Americans decided to become infected with a collective case of xenophobia. Yet after all Iraqis have been through under the occupation, we're expected to be tolerant and grateful. Why? Because we get more wheat in our diets? Terror isn't just worrying about a plane hitting a skyscraper. Terrorism is being caught in traffic and hearing the crack of an AK-47 a few meters away because the National Guard want to let an American Humvee or Iraqi official through. Terror is watching your house being raided and knowing that the silliest thing might get you dragged away to Abu Ghraib, where soldiers can torture, beat, and kill. Terror is that first moment after a series of machine gun shots when you lift your head frantically to make sure your loved ones are still in one piece. Terror is trying to pick the shards of glass resulting from a nearby explosion out of the living room couch and trying not to imagine what would have happened if a person had been sitting there. The weapons never existed. It's like having a loved one sentenced to death for a crime that they didn't commit, having your country burned and bombed beyond recognition, almost. And then after 2 years of grieving for the lost people and mourning the lost sovereignty, we're told we were innocent of harboring these weapons. We were never a threat to America. So this reflects, I think, a voice within Iraq. There are many others. Some are more pro-American, as we know. But then there are a number, I think, of these kinds of voices that are present there. People have suffered as a result of our actions. And if we're talking about the war on terror, I think part of that war should not be just combat operations by whatever side's armed forces you're doing, but it has to be a campaign to really win the hearts and minds of those indigenous peoples, local peoples, and not invade their homes in the middle of the night, drag them off to prisons where they might be tortured, etc. Just to give you quickly an overview of a recent poll that was done by the Zogby Polling Institute in the Arab world. This poll was conducted in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Jordan, the United Arab Emirates, and Lebanon. The figures for an unfavorable attitude towards the United States range from 85% in Egypt, 89% in Saudi Arabia, 64% anti-American feeling in Morocco, Jordan 63%, this is before the most recent bombing, 69% in the United Arab Emirates, 66% in Lebanon. And when people are asked in these polls what has been the most important factor determining their views, number one is what's happening in Iraq. And I found this to be the case in Egypt. I don't know where the Human Rights Watch is coming up with their data about Egyptian attitudes towards the Iraq War, but I was talking with Egyptian Bedouin in the Sinai, 12, 13 years old. The first question they asked me, what are you doing in Iraq? To those people. And this was at the same time that the Israelis were involved in attacking Palestinian camps and killing a lot of civilians. So that gets mixed up with what's happening in Iraq. I am very well in connection with the Christian community in Egypt, which is a minority community, generally pro-American and even pro-Bush. But they're coming to me just 2 summers ago and saying to me, what is this crazy man doing? And these are people that were previously very much disposed to an American point of view. Iraq was the #1 factor in determining the public opinion and attitudes towards the United States in these countries. Second is the U.S. treatment of Arabs and Muslims, as a major determining factor for that, and that's the Abu Ghraib effect. So I think with these kinds of figures, we're fighting a tremendous battle for public opinion. We used to like to portray ourselves as a city shining on a hill. I think that was one of Ronald Reagan's most famous kinds of forms of rhetoric that he would use in his speeches, but we've certainly sunk down to the lowest of the valleys, I think in terms of global public opinion, but also very much in terms of worldwide Muslim and Arab public opinion within the Middle East itself. And we need to be very mindful of that in whatever decisions we make in securing ourselves, but also conducting the war on terror. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan Campo. I'll turn to my colleague Manu Eskandari, and I'm wondering if you have cards on which you are writing your questions. Have they been distributed? Okay. If we could have the students do that while in this next little bit of time. And I would now invite Dr. Eskandari to talk to us about his views.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you, my fellow panelists, for your comments. It's, as was said earlier, it's a bit hard to, if we were tasked to disagree with any points made, it is hard because one finds so many points of agreement. So, indeed, just a few comments. I would first like to thank Lois Capps for being here. As always, she's been a rock of support for not only our views, but also a reminder. I'm an immigrant in this country, as many people are. And I'm a recent immigrant in the sense that I came here for a variety of reasons, but one of them because I thought in this country I will have the right and the freedom to be left alone, which is what draws people to a distant shore. And what Representative Capps has reminded us is that the foundation and bedrock of this country and its calling card around the world historically has been the question of freedom, the question of equality, the question of justice. In practice, of course, politicians have fallen short. No country in the world has achieved this status of being able to say unconditionally that they have lived up to their highest principles. Nevertheless, this shining bedrock that America has had to present to the world in its documents, in the thoughts of its founders, has drawn people to this country who had choices, who had opportunities to go elsewhere. They've come here for a variety of reasons, as I said, but amongst them these. And it is this that America is having trouble presenting to the world today, despite the protestations and the public statements of its presently elected officials. We're reminded again of the disconnect between principles and actions this morning when Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice was reported to have made a statement that in Bahrain that she wants to remind countries of the region to treat people according to principles of the Geneva Convention. And this, of course, immediately was pointed out that America may not be in the position to make such statements at this point. And this is sad. It is sad from my point of view because I came here, I raised my children here. I have students, I'm in the glorious, happy position to be able also to say that over the years that I've taught, I've had hundreds, if not thousands of students to whom I've said these words. And so I feel sometimes that I am a bit of a fraud when I say that America stands for these high principles, because one has to do a lot of explaining then, when in fact, as a political scientist, I should know better that the actions of American officials are quite contrary to its principles. So it's a difficult situation that Americans are put in, and are we as a result safer? I don't know that the question applies here, but are we short of our principles? Is America short of its own stated principles? Most definitely. And that history will have to answer whether America is lessened as a result or increased. As a political scientist, my focus has been on foreign policy, and this morning also, as part of the talking heads, I listened to Richard Haas, who has been an advisor to the administration, and speaking from New York, he made the point that America will have to move towards what he called an integrationist foreign policy. By that, I believe Haas means something akin to multilateralism, something akin to the conversations that we've had about the role of the United Nations. And this is indeed a matter of concern, because I've always found it somewhat ironic that the United States would criticize the United Nations. After all, the United States is the founding member of the United Nations. It is the country responsible for bringing about that institution, and given its power in the Security Council, the United Nations, often outside the United States, has been accused of being a tool of American foreign policy. So it is somewhat ironic, if not funny, that one finds American officials talking about the United Nations as the enemy, or the United Nations as the problem. It is, of course, a problem when one listened to the conversations earlier presented and the conversations of our fellow panelists, that the United Nations will develop a mind of its own, that there will be people who publicly, in a public forum with microphones and cameras that are beaming to the entire world, will disagree loudly. And of course that is embarrassing to people who do not have the self-assurance to learn from criticism, adjust, and have a foundation that will not be weakened by criticism but rather strengthened by it. One would expect such things of American policymakers, because, believe it or not, America is a great power, and it is looked at that way around the world, and not just because of its military might. Of course, that is one aspect. Historians and political scientists tend to look at great powers as exemplars of a particular kind of foreign policy, of a particular kind of action on the world scene. And so America is looked at that way, and part and parcel of being a great power is the ability to absorb criticism, to respond to it, and if the criticism is valid, to adjust to it. One expects that. And the fact that the president feels so threatened at this point that he has to, on Veterans Day, use the platform to belittle and threaten critics of the administration as being somehow that they will be defrocked, or that their, in military terms, that their rank would be pulled, and that they would be considered persona non grata is below what the President of the United States should be doing, and what officials of the United States should be voicing as a principled stance. So in terms of where the United States is going, the question was here, are we safer after 9/11? The question was turned to, do we feel safer? Feeling is a very different question from being. And I'm not trying to be philosophical here. In international relations, the question of perception is a very, very important question. And so there is a perception around the world that America does not feel safe and does not act as if it feels safe. There is also a perception around the world that the rest of the world is not safe, not just as a result of the actions of America, but also as a result of the actions of all those people around the world who now feel empowered. We heard the term mentioned earlier. So instead of providing sound leadership of the kind that would make people feel safer, that there is someone in charge, America has engaged in, and I'm here using a term that was not used, but it has basically been engaging in a dirty war. The term dirty war was a term that was used in the 60s and 70s with regard to the actions of South and Central American dictators who were sponsored by the American foreign policy establishment. These are the tactics that are now being employed by a world leader in its fight against those that have attacked it. And I think in this, America has lessened itself and indeed has made the world less safe. Thank you.
Thank you. While I rummage through these and see if I can't get a representative sample, I wonder if we couldn't begin with a contemporary question focusing on the McCain bill, which is now being threatened. If it succeeds, it'll be threatened with a veto unless the Congress exempts the Central Intelligence Agency from its scope. Would you care to comment? And let's just go in order.
I would comment just by saying I think that's a terrible problem, and we're trying to do everything we can to help passage of that legislation. I think it's important that it's being submitted by a member of the party that's controlling Capitol Hill, and I think Senator McCain has been terrific in speaking out on this issue, and he has unique credibility to do so since he himself was tortured in Vietnam. So I guess the question is really how, let me say this, any war empowers the executive as one of the three branches of government. And this war, because of the way it's being fought, is particularly empowering this executive. The Justice Department memos, the famous memos that were written to justify torture, saying that you could use stress techniques that created physical pain equivalent to organ failure or even death, and that that was okay. Those memos justified this divergence from international law and national law by saying that the president, as commander-in-chief, has the authority to take measures that keep this country safe, put him effectively above the law. Of course, by this logic, we can give Saddam Hussein and Slobodan Milosevic the keys to their jail cells, because they were commanders-in-chief of their countries, and everything that they did is evidently then okay by this logic. The Supreme Court in June of last year tried, I think, to rein in the executive by saying the war on terror is not a blank check. That was Sandra Day O'Connor's term. And tried to assert authority over, for example, Guantanamo Bay and over measures that were being taken by the administration in that regard. Now, we just saw a couple of days ago that the Senate wants to pull that authority back from the court. And we have a Senate vote there that is trying to stop detainees at Guantanamo Bay from challenging their detention, something that the Supreme Court had allowed in its June ruling of last year. So there's a whole tug of war between branches of our government over power. And it has started by the executive branch of government assuming tremendous powers in this war. And when you ask yourself if you're safer as a result of the war on terror, you also have to look at domestic political and constitutional arrangements and how they're being altered by this war. Now, I'm not a constitutional scholar, and I don't think anyone on this panel is. But I think it's obvious that the Bush administration has been saying to the people of America, trust us. We are assuming tremendous powers on your behalf. Trust us. And I think you as citizens have to look carefully at their record and decide whether or not they've earned that trust.
Well, I can only associate myself very strongly with what Carol has said, and let me just add that I would find it extremely odd that a president who has vetoed nothing now in his 5th year in office would exercise a veto against a basic protection of human rights. I find that exceptionally unseemly, and hopefully those around him will persuade him that that's not something he should be doing. If he does, the legislation should be appended to everything that comes along, and Senator McCain has said he'll do that, and by George, we're with him.
I'm fine.
I think these two statements have been right on target. The only thing that I would say is that some of these declarations might not make any difference because the U.S. has a long history of engaging in torture and detention internationally in the various proxy wars it has conducted around the world in Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East. And I think that whatever formal statements are made for or against the conduct of torture, whether it's by the CIA or some other agency, we will still be doing it. And that's something that we as citizens need to expose more and more. Pay attention to the news, pay attention to our involvement around the world and who's doing what to whom. Follow the media, follow the web. I think we have a responsibility to remain conscious and bring those issues and whatever knowledge that we get, use our own intelligence, and bring those to our elected representatives to shine a very bright light on any agencies of our government that would be involved either legally or clandestinely in torture operations.
Thank you. Carol, several people, 4, have asked you to expand on the points that you made at the beginning with respect to what are the answers we can provide to those people who say torture is really okay and it's under certain circumstances an essential ingredient in the conduct of American foreign policy?
Well, I guess I'm the only person here who's not a professor, but let me just say, feel free to take notes because the ticking time bomb scenario, which has been put forward by a number of sometimes very articulate public spokespeople, Alan Dershowitz, who gets a lot of television airtime, I think is really a specious argument, a false argument. And I think it's important to be able to to present the reasons why. I saw a polling that the American Civil Liberties Union did recently on a number of issues surrounding the war on terror, among them torture. And it was focus groups, I should say, not polling. And what people mentioned in focus groups over and over again was that their idea of torture and what was acceptable and what was not was shaped overwhelmingly by one factor in American life. And that factor is the television show 24. And people derive their attitudes about what should and should not be done to people in detention from that TV show. And that's sort of the main marketplace of dialogue about torture, if you can call it dialogue. So any of you who want to start a campaign to persuade the producers of that show to clean it up, I'd be happy to get together with you. The ticking time bomb scenario, it rests on a presupposition, a series of presuppositions that do not hold true in the real world. It's a fantasy created for the purpose of argument. And I would urge you, if you're interested in this is a book that we've recently published with the commercial press. It's a number of essays about the issue of torture, and the essay by our Israeli contributor is particularly persuasive on this issue and why the ticking time bomb doesn't exist. But let me just mention 7 presuppositions, all of which must hold true in order for the ticking time bomb scenario really to come true, which it never does. If you are really going to save innocent lives by torturing somebody to get information, that presupposes, first of all, that you know for sure that there is a bomb. That's hard to know. Presumably the guy in your detention is the only one who's actually seen it. So how do you know there's a bomb? So it presupposes that you know for sure that there is a bomb. Presupposes that you know that that bomb will explode if you don't neutralize it. So it presupposes that the terrorists are professional, that they've made a bomb that's actually going to work. That's also a hard thing to know for sure. It presupposes that the bomb can be neutralized if it's found, that it's not a type of explosive that will explode anyway if it's touched, for example, and that the police or other law enforcement can neutralize it even if they find it, if they get the information through torture. It presupposes that the detainee knows where the bomb is, that he was privy to the information in the first place, and that his cohorts haven't moved the bomb since he was detained or done something with it because they know now that he's in detention. It presupposes that if the detainee is tortured, he will tell where the bomb is, that he's not going to stay silent, that he's not going to die under torture, and that he's not going to give you false information. All of those extremely possible, so very hard to know for sure that if tortured, the detainee will tell. It presupposes that if you get the information out of him, it won't be too late. The bomb won't already have exploded. And it presupposes that there's no other way to find the bomb, that there aren't sophisticated electronic means that could be used to find such a device. So all of those conditions must be met in order for, in theory, the ticking time bomb scenario to hold true. And it really doesn't happen. There aren't ticking time bombs where all of these conditions hold true, people are tortured, and innocent lives are saved. In the essay, my Israeli colleague mentions one case where, as I mentioned before, that the Landau Commission had allowed this moderate physical pressure under some circumstances, ticking time bomb circumstances. The only case where they ever got information, and it was about an Israeli soldier, it wasn't a ticking time bomb, but it was one person who was being held by Palestinians. They tortured someone, got some information, and the Israeli soldier died in the attempt to rescue him. So it doesn't, it's a false supposition that is designed to engender fear in the public that there is going to be a ticking time bomb and that someone's going to have a way to save you from it. And it doesn't really obtain in reality. And I think it has sparked a national conversation, and it sparked a lot of bad television that is shaping people's attitudes about why torture is permissible sometimes. It's never permissible.
Thank you.